Our next speaker is Dr. Barry Castleman. Dr. Castleman has a Doctor of Science degree in public health from Johns Hopkins. And Barry Castleman has worked with numerous agencies of the U.S. federal government in areas of public health, has also worked with many foreign governments in areas of public health, and is recognized worldwide as an expert when it comes to history of asbestos uses and asbestos disease. Barry, we're delighted to have you with us today. Thanks. Oh, and I also should say, Barry and I are neighbors. We live less than a mile apart from each other. So it's a pleasure to introduce you.
I'm going to talk about the history of informing the public about the hazards of asbestos. From the time I started to get involved, I was a graduate student learning about air pollution. My basic training was chemical engineering. I'd worked a little for the chemical industry, decided I didn't want to spend the rest of my life working for a chemical company making pollution and consumer commodities, and went back to school. The government was functional back then. They were creating fellowships for training air pollution control professionals even before the EPA existed. This was 1969, 1970.
And so I started reading about the health effects of air pollutants. I didn't know anything about this stuff. And I came across asbestos. And very quickly I found the big New York conference proceedings, the conference that Dr. Selikoff had organized in October 1964, published at the end of 1965. And by the time I was reading about this in 1971, I also noted that the use of asbestos was still going up. And I was quite amazed at that. The fact that this knowledge existed and yet it wasn't changing our behavior at all. Now about Dr. Selikoff, who I started corresponding with in 1971. Dr. Selikoff published this very historic paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association, documenting the horrendous mortality experience of the insulation workers. There had been lots of case reports up until then, but nobody had looked to the end of their lives and seen just how much excess deaths from lung cancer and mesothelioma, asbestosis, and other cancers were occurring in that workforce. And Selikoff went on the same year. He published that in April to hold the big conference at the Waldorf Astoria for 3 days in October. He then created the Mount Sinai team with the leaders like Arthur Frank and Steve Markowitz and Jackie Moline and many other wonderful people, and created a really an extraordinary group that was publishing a lot of material, doing a lot of investigations. And when the OSHA asbestos regulations came out in 1972, Selikoff slammed that as an unparalleled disaster for working people. He was not at all pleased with the way OSHA had basically sold out in terms of setting exposure limits that were way too high, and warning labels that said breathing asbestos dust may be harmful to your health. Something, may cause serious bodily harm was the language. People don't see that. Cancer and the skull and crossbones would have got their attention, but not that kind of a warning. And the industry had vigorously objected to cancer being on the warning label at the hearings. When Ginther, who was the head of OSHA at the time, was asked by the New York Times to respond to what Dr. Selikoff had said, he said that Dr. Selikoff over-dramatized the matter. Selikoff is a master of the media. Let me start showing you some of these slides. Here. Oh, okay. So here's Irving, many of his publications, and this is the volume of the New York Conference in 1964,
which
got me so fascinated with asbestos that I have spent a long time, the rest of my life since, dealing with it. And this is Paul Brodeur, whom I'm going to talk about in a little while. Selikoff was a master of the media, raising public awareness. He understood the importance of getting the word to the people. He understood that the people generally didn't know this stuff was bad. Later in his life, a TV journalist from Canada told me a story about Selikoff where Selikoff was asked by the journalist, he says, well, the industry people say you're too emotional about the way you represent these issues. And Selikoff didn't miss a beat. He said, well, there's all kinds of cancers that people get that we don't know how they're caused, and we can't really prevent them. But I get emotional about preventable cancer that's not prevented. And he said that in the sagacious way that Selikoff would answer a question like that, turning the word emotional around and saying, yeah, why aren't you mad about that? And that was just an example of, I mean, he never had to call a journalist and say, oh, I'll get back to you later. He knew they were on deadline, and he had an answer every time, and it was in plain English, no professional jargon. He created and edited the medical journals. As was mentioned already, the American Journal of Industrial Medicine broke the corporate monopoly of journals on occupational medicine, starting in 1980, and rapidly became the most popular journal of its kind in the world. Up until then, the British Journal and the American Journal that existed were I mean, the one in the United States had people like the Vice President of Johns Manville on the board of directors. And the asbestos company memos that have come out in the asbestos litigation have shown how they were so bothered about what Selikoff was doing to the asbestos industry and the media, but they had nothing to go up against him with. Then comes this guy along, Paul Brodeur, journalist with the New Yorker magazine, and he wrote a series in the New Yorker about sprayed asbestos fireproofing. Bear in mind, there's no EPA, there's no OSHA yet. And Brodeur is publishing these articles in October 1968 about sprayed asbestos on the girders of these buildings. Sure, some of them had tarpaulins. They didn't do a whole lot of good, 40 floors up in the middle of winter in New York with the wind blowing. But anyway, that dust was falling all over the place. Selikoff would give medical presentations about this and show that dust was, inches deep on the floors of these work sites, saying that some of the asbestos even stuck to the girders, which was its intended purpose. Brodeur closed his article talking about a woman, a well-dressed woman standing on Fifth Avenue, about to cross the street, just brushing the stuff off her shoulders. And what is this? And Brodeur said, what about the children of New York City? And that's how he closed this article. And this led to state and local bans on sprayed asbestos fire, because this was going on all over the country. These skyscrapers were going up in all the major cities of the country at the same time. It was all over New York, but it wasn't just here. And so this was before EPA and OSHA. These local health departments and labor departments were doing these kinds of things. Eventually, the EPA would ban the sprayed asbestos fireproofing in 1973. So Paul Brodeur's articles were extraordinarily important in raising public awareness. Now, Rachel Scott published a book in 1974 called Muscle and Blood. She did lots of interviews with workers, and she would later be hired by OSHA. Also in 1974, Paul Brodeur published Expendable Americans. Again, this followed a series of articles in the New Yorker. So this had gone out in the New Yorker magazine in a series of articles, and then it was published as a book the following year.
And it told about the extraordinary work of
Tony Mazzocchi and Steve Wadka at the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, Joe Wagoner and Bill Johnson in NIOSH, and Shelley Samuels at the AFL-CIO. He also published a Relocate to Mexico memo saying some consultant told the asbestos companies, if you want to get away with not having to worry about EPA and OSHA, you just need to move to Mexico. And I thought, It makes a certain amount of sense. And I started looking at import statistics at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And damn if there wasn't an asbestos textile company that had moved 2 plants across the border into Mexico, one of which I visited. And when there was dust hanging on the fence, you could hardly read the peligro sign, which means danger, from the dust hanging on the fence. And so journalists started writing about these things, and I called these people death merchants. They refused to respond to the press. The company was called Amatex. They were blown away in the early days of the asbestos litigation. But in this book, Expendable Americans, they were mainly focused on this horrendous asbestos factory in Tyler, Texas, and run by Pittsburgh Corning. And the condition, there was dust all over the place. There were NIOSH people, investigators took photographs of it. It's just, there was dust all over the equipment, all over the floors. There was no hygiene at all. And Steve Watka was quoted as that this showed utter contempt for the workers. The asbestos sacks that the asbestos came in was used in, for roses. Tyler, Texas was famous for growing roses and selling them all over the country. And so, whoops. Then the Tyler plant was closed, cut up, and buried. What does it take to inform the people? I found in 1973, I used to hitchhike across the country around that time every summer, just about. And I took my own survey. I found that most of the people I got rides with didn't know what asbestos was, and most of the ones that knew what it was didn't know it was dangerous. And this was confirmed by a survey the asbestos industry had done. Then Eula Bingham organized a conference to train journalists about occupational diseases. Rachel Scott was involved in putting that together. The conference was opened by the Secretary of Labor, Ray Marshall, and Brodeur also spoke, and he was like the featured journalist at the meeting. And he said that the lawsuits are more effective than OSHA, that companies are guilty as hell of knowing about asbestos products being dangerous. The Miller Bill on the Corporate Criminality Act, he also talked about putting businessmen in jail. And Brodeur's conclusions, I want to read you. And you could hear a pin drop in the room. Everybody was listening to what Paul Brodeur would say. Now I want to capsulize what I've learned over the past dozen years, during which I've written 4 books and many articles about occupational and environmental health. I tell it to you for what it's worth. I speak particularly to my colleagues from the press. In these past 12 years, I have never been given a straight answer about industrial disease by anybody in industry. So I learned that industry always lies. I learned that government officials, many of whom are influenced by industry, often fail to tell the truth. And I learned that the Congress, abysmally weakened by timidity and deceit, is being co-opted by industry money. A crisis of occupational and environmental health is approaching us.